Great. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Keir Johnson-Reyes with Intertribal Agriculture Council. Thank you so much for joining us for this policy roundtable. Before we get started, we have a couple announcements here. Intertribal Agriculture Council is working hard to have your stories heard far and wide throughout the country through our survey collection process. Please go to indianag.org and share your story. We also have the opportunity to have organizations sign on to help inform Congress of needs for Native farmers and ranchers pertaining to loan assistance and various loan approaches to support family farms and ranches. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll start with a little, let me stop sharing here for a second. I'm going to start with a little overview of our time together today. I'll start with an overview where Zach, Erin, and Colby will be talking a little bit about the importance of policy, what goes into policy, navigating effectively for sound policy. We'll have a Q&A session that I'll facilitate that'll focus on food security and food accessibility. And then there'll be a time for fielding questions from our Facebook audience, as well as our audience participating through the Zoom account here. Okay, so I'd like to start with introductions here. Today we have with us Zach Ducheneaux, who's part of the third generation to operate a family ranch on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation in north central South Dakota. He and his brothers are now raising the fourth generation on the same ranch. He is a former tribal council representative for the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, also among the third generation to have done so. He has been with IAC since the 1990s, first as a farm advocate, then as a tribal delegate and secretary of the board, then the technical assistance director, and now serves as the executive director with Intertribal Agriculture Council. Colby Duren is the director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, Office of Economic Development. He previously served as the policy director and staff attorney for IFAI since 2017. Colby has over 11 years of experience in federal Indian law and policy with a special focus on food, agriculture, nutrition, natural resources, economic development, which includes work on 3 farm bills. Erin Parker currently serves as the research director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law, where she supports the initiative through program development, research and writing, and analyses of legislative and regulatory issues affecting tribal governments, businesses, and individual producers. So thank you all so much again for spending some time with us today and covering some extremely important topics. To get us kicked off here, I'd like to pose a question to Zach. Just in general, why is policy important?
Thanks, Keir, and thanks everybody for tuning in and listening. Thanks to Colby and Erin and the rest of the crew at the IAC for putting these webinars together and being part of this Intertribal Food Summit. And thanks to everybody that's registered and attending. Policy is important because everything is stacked against ag producers to be doing it themselves. And our country has long since made a commitment to provide affordable food to its population and use that as a major economic tool to drive our gross domestic product. So it's critical that we get involved in the policy that's going to bring that to bear, because as we've evolved more towards affordable food, we've gotten away from the nutritious food. And oftentimes we lose the full benefit. We might have a modest economic benefit, but we're not getting any nutritional benefit from the food that we're raising. And it's important to realize that this policy has to be enacted and enforced and followed up on at all levels. So Colby and Erin are some of the experts in the field about advocacy for policy on a national level. That's with, advocating for Congress, answering the questions that the congressional delegations may have, that the departments may have over in DC, bringing them solutions from the field. Field work is absolutely important in building thoughtful and effective policy. And where I'm at right now, I'm at the annual calf branding of one of our local FSA county committee members. He started with the IAC as a recruit in our livestock risk protection program initiative, where we were trying to get producers taking advantage of RMA products. He got enrolled in that and become active, and now he's sitting on the county committee, not only implementing local policy, but overseeing the implementation of national and statewide policy. The statewide policy is important, and there's on-roads for all of our membership and our friends that are listening to participate in that through your state FSA committee or your state food and ag committees. So the thing that's unique about the policy advocacy that the IAC and IFAI and Indian Land Tenure Foundation, First Nations bring to the table is it's all informed by work out in the communities, out in the pastures, out in the fields, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and then trying to make thoughtful adjustments to it.
Great, thank you so much, Zach. Erin, what information goes into policy, especially maybe pertaining to NAS data?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kier. And before I get started, I just wanted to say thanks again for having us here on the webinar. The Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, I know me and Colby in particular are huge fans of IAC and have been the whole time IFAI has been in existence. So we're always glad to join you all. In terms of what information goes into policy, like the NAS data is a great thing to look at for sure. That's the National Census of Agriculture data is what we're referring to there. And that's a really foundational part of policy to me. I'm a research director, so I like to say I'm a resident nerd. I love that that data piece of policy, because like when you look at that National Census of Agriculture, to me, like data tells a story. Like there are 60,000 American Indian, Alaska Native owned and operated farms and ranches in the United States that we know of from the last ag census. There are 77,000 American Indian, Alaska Native producers. But those are not just data points, they're stories. They're part of the story of a food system of a community. And so for everybody listening who is wondering like how maybe they can participate in policy and what goes into it in terms of information, like that's you and your story. Your story is part of building a solid foundation for policy that tells not only the story of your community right now and your food system right now, but what you want the next chapter of it to be, and how you write that next chapter is participating in tribally led data collection efforts like community food sovereignty assessments and those kinds of surveys, as well as participating in the National Census of Agriculture. IAC has done some incredible work partnering with NAS, the organization out of USDA that runs the Ag Census and has since 1997. And just being counted as part of that, making sure that an Indian country is included in that is an incredibly crucial way to make sure you're participating in policy, because USDA uses those numbers in the ag census to set program levels to look at how they can better serve Indian country through the programs that they have now. Colby can probably speak to this a little better, but on the federal policymaking side of things, like having that snapshot of what Indian country agriculture looks like through the census helps educate policymakers about the needs of Indian country. The growth in this sector has been incredible. If you look at the last National Census of Agriculture, even though in a lot of other categories across the board between 2012 and 2017, there was a dip, that was not the case for Indian country. The number of producers counted in Indian country went up. The value of products sold by American Indian, Alaska Native producers went up. And that just wasn't the case across the ag census, but Indian country agriculture is growing and continues to go really strong. So having that data can really help inform those policy efforts on a national level. So I think that was probably longer than 2 minutes, Kier, but thank you for not playing me off.
Wonderful, Erin. Thank you so much. Yeah, those of us in the field absolutely see the growth in the numbers as well. We're noticing that, county by county, sometimes 2-3-fold increases in our agricultural producers being counted. So that's really great. Colby, could you talk a little bit about effective advocacy and the Native Farm Bill Coalition?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you, Kier, Zach, and all of IAC for having us to have this conversation. really it goes into what Zach introduced and what Erin talked about. I mean, having that kind of grassroots information is incredibly important in actually building federal policy. What all federal policy is, and I think, even Erin and I put on our lawyer hats and say, like, even looking at like what law cases look like, all of these things that go up to the Supreme Court, that go up to Congress, that get debated, that come out as the Farm Bill, the CARES Act, all the large pieces of federal legislation, all come from and stem from issues that happen to people on the ground and the responses that need to happen to ensure that those issues are solved, improved, access is changed. And so having that incredible understanding of not only just what the policy looks like and how that needs to change, but understanding what the whole story of it looks like. What's the story of the producer on the ground? What's the story that the data tells regarding that? And then having a full understanding of saying, okay, this, what this problem is, and then saying, this is the change that needs to happen in federal policy and federal law. And here's where it is. Here's what the change that needs to happen. Here's the black letter law that needs to be tweaked or changed or fixed to have that response. But it all goes back to that story. So being able to have that information, because you can come up with an incredibly detailed piece of legislation and say, this is what Congress needs to adapt. You can go to a meeting or have tribal leaders go to a meeting and explain, like, we want this policy change. But if you can't say that this will, and explain how very clearly that this will have a strong impact on someone on the ground and what this will actually mean, then it's just going to be just an incredibly great idea that doesn't have the context necessary to get people to understand why they need to make that change in policy. So it's really about understanding the entirety of the issue, and then also knowing who you're talking to in Congress as well. And also trying to get other organizations and stakeholders involved. And I think that was one of the strengths of the Native Farm Bill Coalition, an effort that was led by the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community, the IAC, Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative as the research partner, NCAI, and about 170 tribes have currently signed on and joined onto that effort. But what it really spoke to is saying, like, here was a set of parameters of issues that came from the ground that needed to be solved. Here's the background and research and information why, and then here is how to go about making those changes. And what was great about that is then you can then identify, okay, we know that these issues are going to be impact producers in these particular areas. So then you can go identify who would be the congressional stakeholders that would be most interested in making these changes. Then you can start to build that information out. Then you almost have to, have like this huge level of information, then distill it out. And we do a lot of one-pagers, and I think the Native Farm Bill one-pagers may not quite fit with a front and back one-pager sometimes, but trying to be able to have as short of information as you can as possible to quickly tell the story, so you can capture them and say, oh, we do see this as a problem. I need to read more about it. Then it's building the relationships and trust, and that all comes from having the really good stories, the really strong data, the coalition and folks working together, all talking about the same issue and working on solutions as a group to try to make those changes.
Here, I might just add one thing to that, and it's important that you maintain the relationship and maintain the conversation about that, and that's what Colby and Erin are so great at. For example, in 2008, the IAC and several others worked to get a fractionated land purchase loan program implemented. The congressional delegation reached out to another national organization that didn't have the body of information that necessitated the need for that. So the way the program got implemented, it was useless until another farm bill came in and could amend it. So we lost 5 years and $50 million worth of opportunity because that connection wasn't maintained. So that's why we're really glad to have policy roundtables like this to help people remember to keep that on your congressional delegation's radar screen.
Thank you so much. And Zach, while you have the floor, could you talk a little bit about how IAC is utilizing, workshops and, virtual events, any field work that to kind of inform, kind of our approach to policy and advocacy?
Absolutely. A large part of the work that we do out here in Indian country, you see us out in your community, on your reservation, at your local conference room, ideally out in the pasture, but we're getting together. We're fulfilling deliverables and contracts that we've entered into with national USDA organization departments to provide outreach, technical assistance services to you. But primary to all of that is feedback. So whether we're at a conference or we're out there doing a pasture walk with you, or we're doing a virtual meeting like this, it's important that you weigh in with what's going on in the reality that is your interaction with this policy, so that we're able to articulate solutions on your behalf and shop them around to other places that we visit. A lot of times it's you find something that's radically successful in one area because of an interpretation of the policy, and if you do a good job of spreading that word, you can cause that to spread across the country. One place where we dropped the ball on this in the past is the Conservation Stewardship Program was in 2008, 9, 10, 11, the best program that's ever happened to Indian country agriculture. It got retooled and reimagined, and it's not been as successful since 2013. So that's one example of where the policy changed without an identified need for a change in the policy from the field. And we're going to do a better job of helping prevent that from happening in the future.
Thank you so much, Doug. So that concludes our overview section, and thank you all so much for your amazing insights, and it really does help to frame the remainder of our time together today. When we look at food security and food accessibility, each of you provide amazing voice nationally, and I'm really excited about this next section. This is the bulk of our time together here today. So this first question is for everyone. Let's see, in the era of COVID-19, share some tribal food security responses that you've seen and that you feel are paving the way as models to pay attention to. So maybe I'll start with Colby.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I think we've seen a lot of really good responses from tribes on the ground being able to try to do what they need to do and to actually look at and addressing some of the food system challenges. One of the things that's really come out of this, and I will say this from a federal policy perspective as someone who probably likes the Farm Bill more than most people, is that the fact that you have to go back and fix a federal Farm Bill every 5 years tells you something that you need to be thinking about these types of policy changes consistently throughout this. So a lot of the responses that I think that we've seen are really very localized tribal responses, regional responses, and being able to work together and finding ways to patch up where some of the gaps are in the federal food system, in the localized food system that don't have the support that they need to. And so that goes from I think some of pueblos in New Mexico looking at trying to share resources for shipping food back and forth to each other, trying to find ways that they can find either money to help pay for the gas and labor, and also accessing and food. Also looking at trying to how to do more localized purchasing if that wasn't something that was done before as well. So I think those are probably some of the top level things that I've seen. But we pass off to Erin and Zach for more.
Great, thank you, Erin.
Yeah, I would second all of that for sure. I mean, I think for me, just watching the response to this across Indian country and the response to this pandemic, like just in general, all over the country, it shows like what Indian country's always known, like everybody's connected. Our food system is incredibly interconnected. That's not like mind-blowing news to anybody in Indian country, right? And I think that when it comes to our food security safety net, I think all this did, the first thing that jumps to my mind is the impact on FDIPR and the way that FDIPR sites really tried to immediately jump in and help solve this problem to the best of their ability, with still some need for some of those federal policy changes that Colby was talking about to really enable them to be able to do this in a more robust way. And I think this has really showed the importance of that program. There was a 14% increase in that program that we know about. The data is a little slow to come in because of the way that it gets tracked with USDA, but we know for sure it was a 14% increase. And I think that, again, like that's something that we already knew. It's just more evidence that this is a program communities know they can rely on, that tribal citizens know they can rely on in a time of crisis, and they're relying on their tribal government, that's where they go when they need assistance and help. And so improvements to that, I think, going forward are going to be really important. There's a 638 opportunity for it that was in the Farm Bill that would do some of that local purchasing that Colby was alluding to. And I think that's a really critical opportunity to take advantage of, especially right now. And again, those aren't things that people in Indian country didn't already know. It's just like, we have to like acknowledge the way that we're connected to each other and work together to build a more resilient food system going forward.
Thank you, Erin. Zach, would you like to weigh in?
You bet. I think one of the realities that we're noticing right now is that tribes were already started on addressing the challenges that we're seeing as a result of COVID-19. And that's a result of the continuum of work that the IAC and others have done over the last 30 some odd years. And it's actually evidence that the things that we've been doing aren't working. You know, we've had mineral and gas development, we've had 8A contracting ability, we've had hub zones, we've had opportunity zones. None of that has really moved the needle on the poverty that we experience in Indian country. But tribes are really having this awakening, and it's getting accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis, this awakening in food systems and food as a tool for real sovereignty and self-determination. My tribe put out a call to reservation ranchers, and within a few hours had more cattle donated than they could find processing floor for. We heard at the IAC through some of our network that there were pig farmers getting ready to euthanize and bury pigs. We got in touch with our friends at Quapaw, and we facilitated about 300, heck, it was more than that. I think it was about 800 pigs to Quapaw from this part of the country. Quapaw processed them and distributed them to people in need there. And we've got, Erin mentioned the FDIPR sites out there doing work. We've got tribes that are just stepping up and doing the work too. Ho-Chunk is boxing food and distributing it to its community members. So tribes are really becoming aware that a key to prosperity for us in Indian country is not only the economic benefit of food that is produced, processed, and distributed locally, but the health benefits that are going to come from that as well. So the tribes were already on their way for this. And really what we were doing is moving back to what was before the Europeans got here. We had these food systems in place, and we're just moving back to that agriculture as a way of life, agriculture as a tradition for us.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I can absolutely echo what you shared there, Zach, regarding conferring with my technical assistance colleagues, that we're getting inquiries from communities that we may not hear much from on a regular basis, that are beginning to tune into the essential reality of a need to begin looking at the strengths of the opportunities, but also the potential weaknesses in their food systems. And so we think that COVID has really supercharged kind of the awareness there, and something that the IAC and our partners have been out there fighting for a long time. And it's really something to see it come into fruition as a result of COVID-19. Okay, the next question. Thank you all so much. With tremendous impacts on certain staple foods, how can federal policy respond to the specific needs of Indian country, and how can tribes and organizations and partners support this? Colby?
Sure. I mean, I think the real answer to that lies into what what Zach and Erin kind of talked to, and when Zach's saying like going back to and following models that existed. I mean, a lot of this is federal policy can be responsive to what Indian country needs by listening to Indian country, and then allowing federal policy to fit the support system that allows that to happen. An example of this is something that I think, as Zach mentioned, there's that food packaging program, that Farmers to Family Food Box program, which is structured almost exactly like the FDIPR program. if they had listened to tribal leadership for the past decades plus, say, please allow tribes to have the funding to purchase food locally and do the distribution in manners that make the most sense for each of our communities as well. And so, you know, the opportunities to do that existed, but there were some additional barriers to where you only have potentially just Ho-Chunk, and maybe, I think maybe Ho-Chunk might be the only one that's doing that purchasing underneath that program. But if the federal policy had been responsive to it and said, oh yeah, we can absolutely do this, because that type of program, and those things are such an incredible acknowledgement that you have to have stronger localized, regionalized food systems and support that goes into them to build out that. So the best way I think that federal policy can be responsive is to not only just listen to tribal leaders and tribes and tribal producers about how the programs need to fit, but also really recognize that tribal governments are governmental partners that can help and build and expand food systems, food economies, and provide this in areas where a lot of times some of the other programming doesn't reach.
Thank you so much. Yep, agreed. Erin?
Yeah, I would again echo everything that Colby was about to say. I made some notes before this webinar. It's actually almost verbatim, sort of part of it. So that's cool and not scary at all. I think that the way that we get to that responsiveness and that list, like, is to do the active listening, right? And so I wrote like meaningful consultation in all things in my notes, making sure that all federal actors are doing that government to government consultation with tribal nations that we know is so critical to making sure that federal policies are not just responsive to tribal needs, but are enshrining tribal sovereignty as a matter of federal policy in everything that they do. I think that the FDIPR consultation tribal leader group that's kind of come together over the past several years and has been able to sit in consultation with USDA 3 times a year for the past like 3 or 4 years now, is a really good example of how fruitful that dialogue can be, and how that active listening on the part of federal policymakers and regulators can then produce things that are responsive to the needs of Indian country. We saw a lot of changes to FDIPR in the 2018 Farm Bill that came out of recommendations that had been made by tribal leaders as part of that group. Like there's, I think the 638 piece of authority that's in the Farm Bill for FDIPR is another direct outgrowth of that work and that dialogue. So that consultation for me is really, really critical to making sure that federal policies can be responsive. And if you're a policymaker or a regulator and you happen to be listening to this, or you catch a recording later and you want educational resources on like how you do that, please give us a call. Anybody here can help you with that. It's part of what we're for, and part of what we do every day. And I would echo also Colby's remarks about the CFAP, the Farmers to Families food boxes. Another part of that program is another really good example, like another way you can get involved is for tribal nations to comment on regulations whenever possible. So make sure that those voices are heard. It's another way to foster that dialogue between you and federal policymakers. The other part of that CFAP program is the payment program for farmers that was established by the CARES Act. And that's open for comment right now. Actually, there's a limited number of things USDA can provide payments for under that, but they are willing to add more, but they need to hear from folks. There are a couple things that are important to Indian country that I know weren't included in that initially. So aquaculture, bison, I think some pulse crops like lentils. There are comments due on that June 22nd. So if you've got time to just drop a note to the FSA, you can do it online. It takes just a couple of minutes. Just let them know that you want those things to be included as well. It's another way to make sure that the federal policies are responsive to what Indian country needs.
Thank you so much, Erin. Zach, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would. And I'm going to use the example of protein and the staple food of protein. All across the nation, grocery stores were short of protein, specifically beef and pork. But beef is a big thing in Indian country. My tribe grows 50,000 head of some of the best cattle in the country, and our grocery store is rationing hamburger. And rationing hamburger at a price of $6, $7, $8, $9, as high as $10 a pound. And the challenge that brings leads into the next point. But before I get into that, I want to stress to everybody that's listening or that may listen in the future, if we can build the local policy through tribal authority to have our own food systems that will secure investment, we won't need to be talking about FDIPR and SNAP and shortages of food in our communities anymore, because we'll have the solutions here and we'll be growing our own food here, feeding our people from it, and we'll be exporters of food instead of importers of food. So I think it's important that we really share with our tribal leadership. It's critical that they look towards the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative's model food codes, the model ag codes, and adopt some of those with their own flavor, so that we can have a Acoma Pueblo meat inspection code, so that our friends at Trilogy Beef, who have started up to fill that protein shortage at Acoma, can actually do it locally instead of having to ship it 200 miles to bring the meat back there to feed their communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Zach, I'd like to ask if you'd keep with the floor there. With regard to food and commodity pricing, can you speak about the current issues concerning fair pricing, you know, for cattle and other types of production, and then producer level food income?
Absolutely. And this, I hope they got a bleep switch on you, Kier, because this is usually where I start to cuss about things. But as an example, at the livestock auction just the other day, a fella sold an 1,100 pound cow for $766. In the meat, using today's stores at the local grocery stores, the local price for hamburger, that is $4,000 worth of hamburger. It's going to go somewhere, spend a week or 10 days of its life off that reservation, and then come back into that store, and all of that economy is going somewhere else, because the grocery store ain't getting it at a cheap price either. They're having to charge the consumer based on what they're getting it from the supplier. So the key is to have that $3,800 worth of economy happening in Indian country. And that's what's really going to move the needle on these persistently impoverished communities. You know, it's the same case over and over and over again in Indian country. We're net importers of food, but we have the natural resources to create food products that are exported, turned into food, and if we're lucky, we get it back. You know, there isn't very many products that we see in our local grocery stores that wear the made or produced by American Indian trademark that the IAC offers Indian producers the opportunity to use, because it loses its identity in the food chain. So we've got to really stress that we've got to build our own policy. We've got to seek investment, not charity, to develop our food systems so that we can start to close that circle and build this economy here with our food dollars.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, absolutely. Erin and Colby, what are some examples of how responsive policy may address the issue of fair pricing?
I'll jump in really fast here because Zach mentioned our model tribal food and agriculture code that we have, that we've developed here at IFAI. And I think that my first thought about this question was really in that area of tribal law and policy, that this is something that tribes could take a look at doing locally, like through their own legal codes, could like build a tribal department of ag that looks at this. I was also thinking a little bit about like more robust partnerships with like our tribal colleges and universities, and how federal policy can be a part of the funding stream that develops the resources that tribal colleges and universities can use to build out agricultural economics and the kind of those resources that really underpin that policy, just to bring it all back to the data stuff I was talking about at the very beginning, to look at those numbers locally for a community and see what a fair price is like within that community. I think that maybe that's my initial answer, is to just do this as a matter of tribal law and policy. I don't know if Colby has additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you know, with that, you know, it's building that and doing that at the tribal, but you know, if there's a federal policy response, I know this is something that the IAC and Zach has pushed for. It's It's allowing things like the Federal Meat Inspection Act to allow for tribal inspection of meat. And so then you can take those, the stuff from the Model Food Code that Erin talked about, it be implemented. And then not only do you have that, then you also have that federal level acknowledgement that tribal governments that go through these processes to pass these codes have the same right as a state does to be able to implement that. And then not only do it within tribal boundaries, but then also be able to ship it and send it to other places, to other tribes around them in their community or around Indian country. But a lot of this, when you're talking about like really responsive to pricing, it has to happen at the local level, but the federal policies have to reflect the importance of the local policies that need to be in place. And it's something that we talk about, I think often. I mean, there's so many large scale federal policies, but so much of food and agriculture is local. It's tribal codes, it's state codes, it's other local governmental codes and structures. And so the federal policy has to reflect that. So a big part of that is the tribal parity component of that recognizes and acknowledges that needs to be included as well. So you have some stronger things there. So that way then you can account for the localized data. And I would even say probably making sure that you have the data sharing necessary as well too, as Erin talked about it. You can get that good shared data so that you can make those decisions for what that is. And then you can make that determination so that outside influences aren't coming to that. But that is something that can be, that the federal policy can have a strong role in as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, what everybody's speaking on today, it is making me think about the power of agriculture as, a mechanism for, sustained and continued growth within our communities. And there's all of these layers. It's so wonderful to work with, young people in Indian country who may or may not have exposure to the various components that make up agriculture and food systems within our communities, and just to see that there's this marrying of the localized as well as the federal support that is absolutely essential in driving things forward when it comes to policy. And so thank you so much for speaking on that, and Zach as well for speaking on just the sheer dollars and cents that we're talking about here when we boil it down to a single cow being sold in the process there. So with our last of our formal questions here, this goes to everybody. Share your vision for Indian country's agriculture supply chains and the opportunities currently present for tribal governments to consider. Zach, would you like to start us off with that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna talk big picture and long-term vision. And so right now we've got them made or produced by American Indian trademark for almost anything you could grow or harvest in Indian country. But we've got a longer range vision that our crew at the American Indian Foods Program at the IAC are working on, to where we're going to go out and start to verify everybody's practices as well. Are you growing things in a way that are harmonious and fit with your ecosystem? Is this something that an Indian would have done 500 years ago? If it is, by God, here's our stamp of approval. Let's help you do that good, because all of the ecosystem and conservation efforts that we take in Indian country that are innate in us are only as good as the end of our boundary. So just across that fence over there, someone might be spraying 2,4-D or Roundup or something on things that are really getting in the way of the development of product that we're trying to do. So that's one thing. Another thing that we're trying to build through our CDFI Akiptan is a model for philanthropic and institutional investors to divest themselves from the volatility of Wall Street and reinvest in Main Street rural America. Take your money out of Wall Street, move your endowment out here into the community where it can do the good that your charitable giving seeks to do. We've got a plan we're rolling out here in the fall, and we hope to really be able to facilitate a lot of that type of investment in Indian country agriculture to prove that it can work there, so that we can build the solution for all of rural America.
Thank you so much. A response just came in. I was checking really fast, Zach, saying that said, can't see the guy speaking.
They're in luck.
Never mind the man behind the cloak there. Thank you so much. Erin, would you like to field next?
Sure. I think that for us at IFAI, we like to say like the work that we do is putting tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. And so I think that as a vision for the future, like that's where I start is with tribal sovereignty and looking at supply chains that are driven by priorities that have been identified by tribal nations as sovereign governments. And that is the solution to this, which is just another way of saying exactly what Zach just said. So I think that we definitely agree there. And I mean, there are some really exciting opportunities as a matter of federal policy that really, I think, move the needle towards that, and acknowledging that tribal governments can and always have and will in the future be that actor that is guarding food systems and the people and foods and natural resources that have sustained tribal nations from time immemorial. And 638 is a really good example of that in the FDIPR context. I'm actually doing a webinar in like 20 minutes on that. So if you haven't heard me talk enough about it today and you want to jump on yet another webinar, you don't have Zoom fatigue, I'd love to talk to you about it in 20 minutes. But that's what that's all about. And that's what that recommendation from the Native Farm Bill Coalition was about acknowledging the role of tribal sovereignty in everything, but especially in agriculture. So I think that's my answer.
Thank you so much, Erin. Colby?
I won't go and repeat other than just say amen to everything that Zach and Erin said about that, and this really being sort of, truly tribally driven approaches to developing food systems. And that's what federal policy has to be responsive to. And so I think a larger vision of that, even looking at the federal policy context, is, long-term down the road, the fact that we may not even ever have to tell people, oh, hey, by the way, you didn't include tribes in this provision of this bill you're looking to do, that is something that is becoming a regularly occurring thing, that folks are not only just thinking, oh, well, there needs to be a tribal part of it. Oh, there needs to be this. And it's like, that is included at the beginning. Tribal producers and tribal leaders are at the table helping develop these policies. And I would say that probably true level of inclusion could be, because without that information there, we're not going to not only have as strong of a food system, we won't even have as strong food economies as we potentially could by having all the stakeholders at the table. So I think that's kind of my very quick vision of at least what it would look like from the policy perspective, the federal policy perspective.
Thank you so much. Wow. You all are so spot on with your timing. I'm just balled over here.
First time. All right.
Hey.
Yeah, if there's nothing else to add to this section, we can move to questions from either the Facebook audience or those that are participating via Zoom. Are there any questions out there?
Courtney says no questions on Facebook so far.
Okay. Would one of you all be willing to field a question regarding, kind of the top priority areas that the Native Farm Bill Coalition is taking up in the coming months?
I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll kick it over to Colby and Erin. We want to change the world of ag finance with the emphasis on finance, and to really shift the paradigm from one of credit and debt and lender and borrower to investment and partners. So we're really going to be advocating for system changing finance capacity for Indian country organizations, producers, and food system purveyors, so that we can really start to make that impact ourselves. We've talked in the past about the 2030 Farm Bill. As we get further into this, man, I sure hope that Indian country can be doing its own thing by then. And maybe my tribe and Kira, your tribe in Oklahoma, and my friend Gilbert Lewis's tribe with Trilogy Beef on Acoma Pueblo. All of our tribes have their own version of a farm bill, and we're implementing tribal policy to maintain strong and robust food systems that transcend the next crisis. And I'll kick it over for Colby for the specifics about the Native Farm Bill Coalition stuff that we're going to be rolling out. And Erin.
Yeah, sure. I know Zach talked about a lot of the stuff changing finance. So there's been a lot of discussions about that. I would also say there's been a lot of interest and support about trying to figure out ways to allow for tribal governments to have access to some of the programs that they currently don't. I think one of the biggest examples of that is a program that some folks may or may not be familiar with, but it's the Emergency Food Assistance Program, TFAP. States have access to it. We think 5 tribes have access to it, but trying to get tribal governments included as part of that program. There's a lot of support for looking at ways to try to not only take the CARES Act funding that was included in there for the FDIPR program, which was $100 million, 50 for infrastructure, 50 for food, but taking that money for food and then allowing that localized purchasing to happen exactly as that Farmers to Family Food Box program happened. And so I think that there is some support, at least maybe from congressionally regarding that. But again, it's a true recognition of the fact that when you're looking at what these policy changes are, that they have to happen at the tribal level, and the tribe and tribes and tribal producers have to be included in that. And I know there's some additional ones on staffing for differ, and I could hand it over to Erin on those.
We're getting about four questions deep now, so I just want to give you all that heads up. People are starting to roll in with their questions. Go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, I think I would just add really, really quickly that moving forward, more robust 638 authority for FDIPR and actual 638 authority of any kind for SNAP. That's my really quick answer. I see all the awesome questions pouring in, so I don't want to go into any more detail than that, but I think that's immediately what comes to my mind.
So question, I believe it came from Facebook. What are the major internal and external challenges to getting the work done? We've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. And I think it's more a general and in scope type of question.
I'll jump right in on that one. So the biggest challenge that we all have is finding the money to help people make these improvements. We live in an ecosystem of scarcity where Colby and Erin and I and those that have come before us in these roles have to go from grant opportunity to contract opportunity to do this. We feel if we can shift this paradigm to one of investment and finance, the money to do all of this will be circulating in our reservations. Our goal is to work ourselves out of work by 2030, not to have to build an empire of doing this. We want it to become ordinary, everyday thing for all Indians to be thinking about, man, I'm glad I'm eating food that was grown here. Not consider it some mythical thing that used to happen. We want it to become ordinary, and we've got to be able to develop the capital stream into Indian country to create the infrastructure and the resources to do that on a long-term basis. That's going to solve a lot of our issues. Very good question. Thank you.
Colby or Erin, anything to add to that?
I'll just add really quickly. I think we've seen a lot of really exciting movement across Indian country towards developing more tribal law and policy around food and agriculture, whether that's protecting resources from developing businesses, whatever it has to do about agriculture. We've seen a lot of interest in that, and also in developing entities as a part of tribal governance structures that do that work, like tribal departments of agriculture and similar. That is a place to not only house all of that work within the tribal government itself, but also a signal to external regulators that the tribal government's got this, so nobody else needs to bother with it, because the tribe as a sovereign is dealing with these things.
All right, Colby, anything before we move on?
Only thing I would say very quick, because it goes into a lot of other stuff, is I would say really the continuation of having strong voices at the table. So if there are things that are going on at your tribe, your community, with your production, all of that, making sure that your voices are heard. And that is not only talking to the IAC, to us, to the Native Farm Bill Coalition, to any other organizations you work with, but also raising that to your representatives in Congress, to your senators as well, too, and to not be shy about that, because the need to continue to have the messages said and spoken is incredibly important. So I would say that is one, is just to have that, and Zach talked about this, the continued communication and continuing to follow up. So don't ever be afraid about that if there are some of those issues that you're experiencing, to keep doing that, because that is so beneficial and helpful to ensuring that can just be, they're not just one-off solutions where sometimes we'd be like, oh, hey, like we solved this problem, we passed something in a bill, like we're fine. It's like, nope, that's great, that was a great achievement, but there's also additional things that need to have happening as well.
Thank you so much. All right, so if everybody's in agreement, we'll go to kind of popcorn responses for the next 5 minutes or so. So feel free to just let me know if you'd like to field it. Are you doing anything to protect ancestral food sources on a policy level, specifically to protect wild foods?
I can do this. So there's our model tribal food and agriculture code has some templates to protect like traditional foods and seeds, but specifically for wild foods, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission actually did a whole food code specifically on wild food protection. And it's awesome. Philomena Quebec at Glyphwick is the person to talk to about that. And I'd be happy to, I think I have her contact information. I can share that with Keir so he can share that with anybody who needs that info. But they are an awesome resource on that.
Keir, if I could, I'll just really blast in there quick with some popcorn on that.
Sure.
When we managed this continent, there was no such thing as wild foods. We managed the resources, we harvested sustainably, and made sure that we were maintaining the ecosystem to continue to produce the things that we found that were beneficial for us. So one of the things that we really want to try to emphasize is that isn't a wild turnip out there. Our people made sure that there were turnips for generations and generations and generations to come. We're trying to empower our tribes and our individuals to have that on their mind and build policy and code that help support that. But I do think that we actually supported, through the Native Farm Bill Coalition, some intellectual property language in our Farm Bill efforts. And I'd have to defer to Colby as to whether or not that did get into the packet that was approved.
There was a GAO report that was requested, and ended up not getting it. It was one of like the handful of things that was left like on, I guess, the drafting room floor. But that was reintroduced this Congress and in the Senate by Senator Heinrich. But that would be basically a study looking at the ways to utilize IP property to protect traditional seeds, particularly in foods. And some of it is looking at and getting, at least from the federal government's perspective, how it views its own set of laws and regulations regarding what can be done with that. So that way you could have that research done and saying, okay, well, this may or may not be adequate to do that. I think we could probably guess what the answer is. Then what needs to happen to change to ensure that those protections can happen? So I would say something like that's still an open issue. And it's something that is, I mean, not only just an open issue, but it's something that's like involved in current discussion and had been, I would say, last, to the best of my knowledge, like up until February of this year.
And the impetus for creating the trademark was the fact that $1 billion worth of products were being sold a year that weren't genuinely American Indian. So we've got 108 products under trademark now. And Charla, thanks for the question. Let us know if we can help you get your products trademarked.
Yeah. Thank you all. After having read through the report on desired policies for the 2018 Farm Bill, I was wondering what were some of the policies that you were able to get inserted in the 2018 Farm Bill that was in the report? How do you solve the underwriting problem with investors, or is it all at risk with regard to investments? So it might be a latter part there. Another question. Yeah, so would anyone like to field the initial question there and talk about some of the documentation that can be shared around?
Sure, I can talk quickly. First of all, I really appreciate you reading all of our 2018 Farm Bill materials. We know it was a lot of information. There's several hundreds of pages. So out of all of that, I think, Erin and Zach, I think we boiled it down to at one point, maybe 80 pages worth of stuff of asked. And out of maybe a little bit more, and I think we ended up with 63 tribal specific provisions that ended up in the bill. And there's 12 titles to the Farm Bill, for folks that don't know, and it was 11 of the 12 titles. And it's only because there was very little done in the energy title. So they exist almost all the way throughout, from through livestock provisions, conservation provisions, trade, nutrition. Erin talked about 638 authority in that as well too. Rural development, research, forestry, the other 638 provision in forestry as well, horticulture, as well, tribal regulation of hemp, local market inclusion, particularly for the new what's called farming outreach training and opportunities. It's another new acronym that they do in federal law. It's showing that you can make an acronym out of any set of letters. But that's local marketing access for folks that have smaller things that want to grow their production. So specific inclusion for tribal producers in those programs. But there's a substantial amount of them. If you go to our website, and Erin posted it in here, there's a list of all the tribal specific provisions. So I don't know if I missed any ones other folks want to highlight, but those are just kind of overall what they were.
Thank you so much. All right, so for that second question there, and I think that'll wrap us up, how do you solve the underwriting problem with investors, or is it all at risk with regard to investments?
I think education to the investors is an important tool. Along with that education, so we've got a network of native CDFIs that have been out here doing finance and investment in Indian country at the grassroots level for a couple decades now. They're all able to exist, and their cost of funds is higher than the local bank or the local credit union. So they're able to serve what is determined to be the riskiest borrowers and maintain an existence and grow their ability to serve. What if they could get fair terms of investment? And I think we're just going to have to do a better job marketing the impact, marketing the effectiveness, and marketing the outcomes of our native CDFIs, along with creating a pool of capital that will serve as a guarantee pool for those investors that want to come into Indian country. The IAC is going to step out there and try to raise some capital to provide that guarantee. So an investor could say, I want to put $50 million in Indian country agriculture and food systems through CDFIs, but I'm worried about the risk. I don't know enough about it. We're going to raise enough money to guarantee that investment so they know they won't lose. And once they see that that's not as risky as it looks to start with, there's going to be more coming, and we're not going to have to use our guarantee to do it.
Thank you, Zach. Any other comments to wrap us up on that particular question? No? Okay. Well, again, thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you to Zach and Colby and Erin for your time that you spent with us. It was extremely informative, and the topics that were covered are so relevant to where we're at and where we find ourselves in the era of COVID-19, but of course much beyond that as well. Again, I did post my information in the chat there, so that if anybody has follow-up questions, I'm absolutely glad to help to field those or ensure that they get fielded by one of our wonderful panelists here today. It literally just struck the hour, and again, thank you all for just amazing responses and really just an excellent time together here today. Please ensure that you visit both the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and the Intertribal Agriculture Council's websites. We got a lot of information that we roll out on a weekly basis, and we so appreciate your time with us today. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erin.
Bye-bye.
Bye.